Hey church, Pastor Shane here with another community group discussion starter video. This week we wrapped up our sermon series on spiritual disciplines, a series which we called Spiritual Nourishment, Unforced Rhythms of Grace. And you know what might be a good idea this week is if you start out your conversation, you could go through the opening question that's in the sermon discussion guide, but you may actually want to talk about some of the other spiritual disciplines that we've been talking about. As time has gone on, have you talked more about celebration? Have you thought about a Sabbath or rest more? Have you started practicing some of those? How's that been going? Or even, what are some other spiritual disciplines that you may want to practice or even practice with your group? It would be worth it to spend a little time talking about that. But the spiritual discipline that we talked about this week was the spiritual discipline of giving. We talked at the beginning that money and giving is hard to talk about in the church for a variety of reasons, and that we don't always think of giving and generosity as a spiritual discipline, but that actually, when we looked at scriptures, that there's a spiritual element to giving, that giving actually helps grow our faith and helps us become more like Jesus and changes our heart. And that we should go about our life of giving not just because the resources are needed, although they are very helpful, but because it might help transform and change our lives. That as we are generous, we end up acting like Jesus was, who is so generous to us. When we are giving to others, we are trusting in God to give. And so not holding so tightly onto what we have, but trusting on God to provide what we need. There are so many spiritual benefits to getting into giving. We talked about it as a spiritual discipline, as an unforced rhythm of grace. That it's not about feeling guilty, it's about seeking God and having Him transform your heart to be generous and to give. That it should be something that's established as a rhythm in your life. That if you want that consistent growth over your life, you have to continue to give and make it a habit, make it something that you are constantly growing and developing in. And that when we practice this spiritual discipline, we rely on God's grace. His grace, that we're not trying to earn something from Him, that we are relying on Him for all things. We're relying on Him to provide for us, just as we realize that He shows us grace, that we can only give as much as what we have. That this is not about guilt or feeling bad about the seasons when we don't have as many resources. It's about giving what God has given us and trusting Him with that. And so my prayer is that as you think about giving, that you would sit down and have a conversation with your family if you have a family, or sit down with your budget as you think about a budget and be like, I want to start doing this in some kind of rhythmic way, giving somewhere to somebody, to something, that help establish this as a spiritual discipline in my life. And I think you will be overjoyed at the work God does in your hearts when you really sit down and pray and think about, God, how am I giving? Where should I be giving? Or if you're someone that's already giving and just kind of doing it automatically, just paying attention to it and being more, even more generous, but being more cognizant of it, thinking about it more, praying through it, you may experience more spiritual benefit by kind of applying that in the right direction, by really paying attention to your giving, to asking God to change your heart, for asking God to grow in your trust of Him as you give. I hope this series we only did a couple spiritual disciplines, but hopefully it's an encouragement to you, these unforced rhythms of grace, how they could help grow and develop our spiritual life, glorify God as we seek to become more like our Savior. Hope you have a great conversation.